grande ospite internazionale che ha diretto a lungo la British Interplanetary Society, Mark Hempsell. Prego. Welcome. Stage is yours.
Well, good morning. I think we're in for a fantastic weekend. You're going to find a rather large stand, stand 5, which is got British Interplanetary Society all over it. We thought you might like to know a little bit about what the British Interplanetary Society actually is. But I should say the stand is organised by our Italian branch, which is very active if you want to join. Right, let me take you back to 1930s Liverpool, and specifically this address where on October the 13th, 1933, Phil Cleater founded the British Interplanetary Society with a few friends. He was copying the American Interplanetary Society, which later changed its name to the American Rocket Society and then became part of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. But we stayed true and faithful to the true religion, and we are still the British Interplanetary Society. You'll see that after a few months, we produced the first copy of the journal. That journal is still going, and there it is, with a very convincing spacecraft on the front cover. But what else do you do in 1930s if you want to go into space? Well, you talk a lot about it, and they did a lot of that. But also you make things. And this was going across the world. I've got to say, I own up that our stuff may not look quite as spectacular as what was going on elsewhere, but we do think that the RR-47 is the world's first 3-stage rocket. What dampened our enthusiasm a little is there was an accident in an early test flight and 2 spectators were slightly injured, and this man here, Eric Burgess, was up before Manchester Magistrates Court, charged under the 1875 Explosives Act. His lawyer brilliantly argued that if you take an explosive and put it in a rocket, it's not an explosive anymore, it's propellant, and he got off. But it did rather dampen our enthusiasm. Of course, we then have the war, and that changed everything. After the war, they have these big intercontinental missiles, which actually opened up the space race. But of course, this is for big companies with then millions to tens of millions, nowadays hundreds of millions to billions of, well, whatever currency unit you want. It was clearly out of the reach of amateurs. So what we did in the 1950s was studies. Most famously studying in the late 1940s, early 1950s, proving that men could land on the moon. We also looked at space stations, wing shuttles, and that sort of thing. One interesting thing in the context of modern times is this one here. Gatlin, Kunish, and Dixon in 1951 showed that with the rockets that we had, you could launch small unmanned satellites that could do useful things. So this is the start of small satellites, which is where we're going to end up. So why is it now the preserve of big companies and huge budgets? Well, space has a lot of things in it, well, a few things in it, that make everything just different and more difficult to do. So you need to have lots of research to do this. It's much more difficult place to work than the Earth. Or is it? When you look at the Earth, there's actually more things to go wrong, more hazards, more threats, more difficult things to deal with than there is in space. It is just that we've had thousands of years working out how to build things on the ground, and only a few decades of knowing how to build things in space. So my starting message is that space is not dangerous or difficult, it's just different. Now that may seem a strange thing to say after what happened yesterday, but where we've had fatalities in astronautics, it's always been when we've been trying to fly. It's always been on the up or the down. when you're actually in space, it's actually a safer environment. We've already had collisions, explosions, fires in space, and they've been able to deal with them, and no one has lost their life. So, do we really need to spend huge amounts of money on satellites? This is perhaps a bad example. MBSat is the most expensive satellite ever to be put into Earth orbit. Now, normal satellites cost in the hundreds of millions of mark, but there's a company in the UK and a few others, but we think Surrey Satellites is probably the world leader, who makes satellites knowing where to make the differences and knowing where not to make the differences. And their satellites typically come in at 10 million euros. Now, you can buy a car for 10 million euros, but maybe not a car that you or I are going to buy. Things changed radically in 1999 when Stanford University and the California Polytechnic State University invented the CubeSat format. These are satellites that are 10 centimeters cube. They have a special launching dispenser. It makes them very easy to build, and you know what to do to get them into space. These cost around 100,000 euros, a project involving this. So in car terms, that is a Porsche 911. Now, I can't afford a Porsche 911. I'm sure we can all agree that this is a travesty against natural law and the will of God, but it remains the case that I can't afford a Porsche 911. If we're going to have something that my target audience can build, i.e. me, we're going to have something a little more like that. And this is why at the Society we have a project that we call QCube, which is, and the target here is to make a satellite for under 100 pre-Brexit pounds. This means that schools can build it. It means that university undergraduates can build it. It means that we really can start looking at it almost as a hobby. So let's have a look at CubeSat. We're still using the CubeSat format, but we're only a quarter the size. So we can launch 4 of these in one CubeSat format. What we're trying to do in the Society is to get a design where we've taken out the difficulty, where we've worked through the difficulties of working in space, and then we will put it out as a public domain so it's viable as a student project or a school project. There's 2 versions. In the UK, we're building one which is based on the one shown here, which is based on the Raspberry Pi Zero computer. This is something that is designed for education. It's suitable for schools, for beginners. That's why I'm doing this one. But if you've got a steely look in your eye and a few hairs on your chest, then the Italian branch is making an Arduino-based version, which would be more suitable if you want to get the maximum performance out of the device. So these are the sort of technologies that we are using to get that cost down. I'm hoping that while we're here, we will be able to pick up more ideas about how we can get the project doable and for people at that sort of level who haven't had experience making satellites before. And so I look forward to seeing you on Stand 5. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. Okay.